Hi everyone, welcome to today's workshop. It is a cold and wet out there, and I'm grateful that you have attended. And I know it is also late in the evening and you want to be warm and relaxing, but thank you. So tonight's workshop will be my last workshop for the year, but there was more to come as we do one every single month at Provolution Health. So I'll just share my screen. And we'll get started. Alrighty, so today's workshop is all about shoulder pain. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Cindy and I'm a chiropractor here at Provolution Health. We're located in Queanbeyan, and our topic is going from having sore to sore shoulders. So today, I'll just want to quickly run through what we'll be talking about. I want to talk about the basic anatomy and physiology of the shoulder, what are the common conditions there are, as well as its causes, and what's the relationship between chiropractic and shoulder pain, and why does chiropractic care really differentiate from other alternative healthcare options and treatment options for shoulder pain. So let's get in by talking a little bit about anatomy of the shoulder. So the shoulder in itself is, imagine you've got a ball, right? Like a tennis ball, but a ball, and then it's got that's the top part of your arm. And then that ball sits into a socket, and that socket is what's made up of your shoulder blade. Now, at the joint itself, in between, there is cartilage. So within, on top, you have what we call the labrum. And then outside of that, beyond the outside, we then have 4 muscles and tendons that mostly stabilize the shoulder joint and allow for movement. And that is the supraspinatus, the subscapularis, the teres minor, and infraspinatus. Now, then, as those muscles and tendons allow for movement of the joints as well as part of the bones, we then also have other parts, which is the bursa. And the bursa is a sac of fluid that sits in between the acromioclavicular joint, which is the acromion, which is your collarbone, and then also sits then between your shoulder. Now, the bursa is quite a common location of pain, but we'll get back into that later on. Now, once again, I want to highlight the 4 main rotator cuff muscles and tendons, and that is, we have the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus underneath, the subscapularis, and the teres minor. And this helps for the main ranges of motion of your shoulder, which helps you bring your arm up, down, sideways, inwards, outwards. So let's get into the conditions, and I want to start off by talking about tendinopathy. So tendinopathy is a broad term used to talk about tendinosis and tendinitis. So what's the difference? So we're talking about the tendons of the shoulder here, right? Which is the tendons of supraspinatus, infraspinatus, subscapularis, and teres minor. So you can see here, these are the muscles in red, and the white part is the tendon that's involved. So the difference is tendinitis, the itis means inflammation, which generally is when something's acute. You've had a fresh injury. It's new, it's inflamed, and it's because of perhaps you spent all weekend perhaps wood chopping, or you had a fall, right? It's a new injury, so it's very inflamed. Tendinosis, on the other hand, is chronic. It's the opposite. It means you've had an injury to your tendon for a long time, to the point that it's now structurally damaged the tendon itself. So it could be part of osteoarthritis, with wear and tear, or it could even be tendinitis that was never healed or treated properly, and that's why now it's led to tendinosis, and the actual tendon is now getting damaged, and then if the surrounding joints or the bursa is not very healthy and is not functioning well either, that's also going to be contributing into the tendinosis because it's going to be causing compensation. Next up, we're on the topic of rotator cuff again, and that is sometimes you can even have tears. Now, tears generally occur more often than not from having long-term tendinopathy. When there's weakness, there's tendinitis, it gets inflamed at first, and then it gets structurally damaged. You get tendinosis, and then over time, when the body can no longer bear the repetitive motions and the strain and stress on the tendon, it can possibly either partially tear or completely tear. It doesn't mean, though, that you need surgery for the tear, because you remember you have 4 main ones that help move your shoulder. So if, let's say, if you have one that is torn, you'll still be okay so long as you do the right rehabilitation to strengthen the other remaining ones. Yeah? Now, we're going to talk about that. It was all about the soft tissues, like the tendons today. Now I want to talk about the shoulder osteoarthritis. So like I said, the shoulder itself, which is known as the glenohumeral joint, is made up of the ball that sits in the socket, right? Now, the socket itself is what we call has labrum. Now, it allows for glide and smooth movement for the ball to sit in the socket. But in saying that, though, when there's wear and tear and there's less space in between the joints, then you can have osteoarthritis, which then creates less space, and you have damage and possibly even bone spurs that affect into the shoulder blade or the shoulder. So in these images, you can see here, to number 1 is great. Number 2, we have mild, moderate, and severe. So generally in people who have severe osteoarthritis, they would have a lot of constant dull stiffness and ache, and they can with very limited ranges of motion. And then we're also moving on into shoulder impingement syndrome. Now, this is also a broad term for shoulder pain, and it is talking about a number of conditions. So we already spoke about a few before, such as the tendinosis, tendinitis, when there's an injury to the tendon. And we spoke about also the arthritis as well in the joint. But then in the shoulder impingement syndrome, it's generally a combination of a few other conditions happening at the same time. Also bursitis, which we'll talk about in just a little moment. So the really simple test to see if you have shoulder impingement syndrome is called the painful arc test. It's because when you stand with your arm by your side and you bring it to the side, the first few moments should actually be okay, because at that point, it's only the joint moving and the lower muscles. And then you have the arc, then it starts to become painful as the joint compresses in and rolls in. And then that's when you have the activation of generally the supraspinatus tendon as well that impinges. But then it gets better because you get past that point. So this is a really classic test that you can do for yourself to determine whether or not you have shoulder impingement syndrome. But in saying that, at the same time, it's also important to then dive deeper in to see what is your shoulder impingement syndrome made up of. Is it the tendon? Is it the joint? Is it the labrum? Is it the bursa? And so on. So bursitis, I wanted to dedicate a whole slide for this because it is so common. Now, with bursitis, like I said earlier, the bursa itself is a sac of fluid, and it is there intentionally to provide cushioning between two joints. If you didn't have the bursa, it would be really painful for you to lift up every time you lifted up your arm, because the bone of your collarbone and then your arm would then compress into each other. So, but the issue is what generally occurs is when the bursa doesn't actually get smaller, but rather it gets bigger. It gets inflamed, this sac of fluid. And then what happens is, because it gets bigger, you can't move your arm up very far, And when you do bring it up, it then compresses into the joint and then into the nerves, giving you a lot of pain. And in saying that, bursitis is also an interesting condition for chiropractors to treat, because when a bursa is swollen, you don't want to touch the bursa. Just because it's the cause doesn't mean you address it by being hands-on the bursa. So you actually want to leave the bursa alone and support everything around to ensure that the bursa has the opportunity to become less inflamed and swollen through its natural healing processes. Labral tear. This condition is certainly harder to treat, and it is quite common in a lot of sports athletes where there's been a lot of rigorous, aggressive, faster movements. So the labrum is the cartilage, like I said earlier, that sits on that joint of the socket, right? Now, when you have the tears through there, it's harder to heal because there's lack of blood supply. But in saying that though, you can still function and get better even if you have the tear, so long as everything around is functioning well. Frozen shoulder. This is another common condition that we hear about, but its formal name is actually adhesive capsulitis. And what this is in the shoulder joint. Now, outside of the bone, right, we have the capsule fibers. And what frozen shoulder is there's the thickening of the joint's fibers, and it allows for a lack of movement. And it also then often goes hand in hand with bursitis, because when this is inflamed, the bursa's got less room to move, and then it also gets inflamed as well. And so similarly to bursitis, frozen shoulder is also a condition where we really have to work around to allow for that to break up and heal on its own as well. So I've just talked about some common conditions, but I really want to tie it into chiropractic, because at the end of the day, I am a chiropractor, and at Provolution Health, we are a chiropractic practice. So I want to introduce the term subluxation. Now, subluxation, there are two definitions to it. If you're talking in a medical term, subluxation is like a dislocation, but it hasn't completely dislocated. For example, if someone were to dislocate their shoulder, but partially, and it came back in again, we would call it a subluxated shoulder. But today, I'm actually not going to talk about that, but instead, I want to introduce the term vertebral subluxation. So what vertebral subluxation is when there's an interference to the nerve that comes out of the vertebrae, yeah, and that communicates to the brain to talk to the rest of the body about how to heal. And subluxation when there's interference, which means that there's less communication, which can lead to symptoms and signs. So I want to introduce talking about the nerve supply of the shoulder, because today we're talking all about shoulder pain, right? So in your neck, right, it is C5 and C6 that gives supply to the shoulder. So that's why it's so important to start there. If the nerve supply to the joint is restricted, right? So if we, as a chiropractor, we assess the spine and the joint at C5 in the neck, right, is restricted, and there's a lack of movement, and we can feel that there's compression onto the nerve, then no matter what you do to the shoulder, it will not be able to heal at full capacity to 100% function. And that's because you need the nerve from the neck to communicate down to the shoulder for the healing. And then the shoulder needs to give the nerve same feedback back to up the neck into the brain to communicate back and forth and to talk about what's happening. So what chiropractic does is the adjustment removes the interference and allows for that clear pathway for the healing to occur. So that's the starting point of chiropractic. That's what you need to first do to get the shoulder better, to soaring, yeah? So you start by adjusting and finding the subluxation. In that's most commonly would find it in the neck, particularly C5 and C6. And then from there, we can start working on the shoulder as appropriately. So in addition to the adjustment, what else do we do as chiropractors? We have to give you rehabilitation exercises. You need to do the right stretching, strengthening, and conditioning exercises. We would also do adjustments to the shoulder itself to improve the movement of the joint. Then we can do some techniques to break up the fibers, break up the inflammation. We can provide supplements to reduce inflammation. And that's only one thing. Supplements, at the end of the day, it is a healthier version of medication, but it's still a tablet. Well, another better way is eating an anti-inflammatory diet, because it's better to consume. You're going to eat while you're at it. You might as well eat foods that will help with the inflammation throughout your whole body, even though you're mostly targeting the shoulder pain, shoulder joint. So it's a big picture approach. Chiropractic care, people often think of as back pain, neck pain, but in reality, chiropractic care also helps with peripheral joints such as shoulders, as we spoke about today, knees, hips, but it's also like a combination of things. You start with the spine and the nervous system, allow for good nerve flow and communication to get the foundation right. And then on top of that, the chiropractor can then do adjustments and work onto the shoulder joint. And then, last but not least, the client needs to go home and implement the changes. For example, if it's repetitive strain injury, the same thing that's causing it, right? You have to minimize that too. So it's all about getting to the root cause, which is essentially vertebral subluxation and the nerve root of the spine. So I really hope you enjoyed today's video and workshop on shoulder pain. I want to finish off by reminding you all that your health is not actually about how you feel, right? But it's more about how you can function. And I do want to give you hope and positivity that your body can heal if you give it the right opportunity to. And that is always by starting with removing all the vertebral subluxations that you have in place before continuing on with any further care. And if you enjoyed tonight's workshop, you can also find further content with us on Facebook or even on YouTube. And if you're interested in making an appointment to come see myself or one of the other chiropractors, you can give us a call at 6299 2660. Thank you.